Hey Team Bio, welcome to your screencast on population growth models. So we've talked about two basic models for population growth. One, we have exponential growth here. Sorry, one second. Okay, exponential. And this is logistic. And we talked about this. So this form of growth, it starts out pretty slow, and then as the population numbers increase, our growth of our population starts to get faster and 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 faster. And so this can be modeled with the equation G is equal to R times N, where G is equal to our growth rate, R is equal to, actually, N is the population size, and R would be our per capita rate of increase. So let me just give you a quick example. Imagine we have 100 individuals. So we're right here in our population. We have about 100 individuals in our population. So our N is equal to 100. And in this instance, we have our per capita rate of increase is births minus deaths. And so in this case, we have 50 births and 20 deaths. So our rate of increase would be 30, but then we have to divide it by our total number of our population, because remember, it's per capita rate of increase. So we say our increase divided by our total population size, which was 100. So our R here would be 0.3. This is our per capita rate of increase. So we would find that if we take 0.3 and we multiply it by 100, we get 30. So this would be our growth of our population. And if you look at our next point here, we see now we have 130 individuals in our population. And then we could take this number and multiply it again by 0.3 for R, and that would give us our new growth, and we get to our next point here, but we're not going to do all that math. But basically, it would give us 169. Anyway, I think you get the idea. So this formula is G equals R times N. Now, logistic growth is, okay, I want to say one more thing. And I guess you can see that even if the per capita rate of increase is staying constant, as the population size gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, our growth rate is going to increase. So G is only going to get bigger as over time with an exponential growth curve. Okay, our logistic growth model can be modeled with this equation, G equals R times N, looking familiar, K minus N over K. Okay, this looks a lot more complicated, but it's actually not very different. The only new piece in this equation is this K value, which is our carrying capacity. Otherwise, there are no new terms. G is still our growth rate, R is still our per capita rate of increase, and N is our total population size. So let's look at this model when our population size is very small. When N is a small number, if we look at this part of the equation here, the carrying capacity is, let's say, looks like just about 10,000 in this case. So K is 10,000. And N initially is very small, less than 1,000. So when N is very small and K is very big, we see that K minus N would be very close to K divided by K. This term would be very close to 1. So let's write when N is small, this term is close to 1. So when n is small, then this term is close to 1, and so the logistic growth equation looks very similar to the exponential growth rate. So that would just be like multiplying r times n times 1. Doesn't do anything to g. So you can see here, initially, logistic growth looks a lot like exponential growth. G starts to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, just like exponential growth. But there becomes a certain point where now n is getting relatively big. And so this term starts to get closer and closer and close to 0 as k minus n gets smaller. Now our growth rate is going to start to get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. So when n is large, or I guess we're saying n is close to k, g approaches 0. So, and you can see here, we have a leveling off period where now the growth rate of our population is very close to 0 because it's like multiplying, this term is going to approach 0 as n approaches k. Okay, so we have this period of growth where we have slow growth at the beginning when when n is small, and therefore g is going to be small. And then there's a point in the middle where g is very big because n is still relatively smaller compared to k. This term hasn't really kicked in yet, but then as this term approaches 0 here, g gets smaller again. So there's a point in the middle, the inflection point in the graph, where g is going to be the fastest, where the slope of this curve is the steepest. Okay, anyway, why am I telling you all this? Well, there are certain life history traits that we're going to be exploring later on in the week, where we have a group of species that we call R-selected, and they are generally small-bodied and short-lived, and an R-selected species tries to maximize R, or the per capita rate of increase. Generally, they have a lot of babies. Okay, and then we have another life history pattern or trait. Maybe we should say, erase traits, say patterns. That we call K-selected. And these generally are large-bodied, long-lived organisms whose population size nears carrying capacity all the time. So we're going to be exploring a little bit of that next class, but I wanted to give you a little bit of context where R comes from and where K comes from in regards to these two graphs. And then I guess it's helpful to see these two modeled off one another. You see logistic growth mirrors exponential growth at the beginning, and then it tapers off, whereas exponential growth keeps increasing. Okay, obviously, we talked about how this, in the long term, for any species, is impossible because we cannot keep growing indefinitely because resources are not infinite, and most species, that's not even true. Okay. Logistic growth curves are useful models, but they also have some limiting factors. We talked about in class how K is not always constant and can fluctuate given certain environmental conditions. So we're going to be exploring a little bit about that in the next page. So I'm going to scroll down here, and on the other side, I want you to write down density, dependent factors. Okay, density-dependent factors are factors that limit population growth, and whose intensity is related to population density. Factors that limit population growth and whose intensity is related to population density. Okay, what do I mean by that? Well, it might be readily apparent to you that as you increase a population size, you are going to run into limits. Maybe there's not enough food. Maybe now there is not enough space to breed. Maybe there is not enough access to nutrients. Maybe there's not enough access to light. So these would be examples of density-dependent factors. They only come into play as the population size increases, and it's dependent on the density of the population. So this would be an example of intra-specific competition. This is competition within a species. Just how we talked about intramolecular bonds, were bonds within one molecule, an intraspecific competition is going to be competition within a single species. So we have a few examples of that. These graphs are showing you on the x-axis, we have the density of females of the, I think, is this a song sparrow? Yeah, song sparrow population. So you'll see as the density of females increases, the mean number of offspring per female decreases. So the number of eggs that a song sparrow will lay will decrease depending on how many other females are around. So this could be competition for nesting spaces, or it could be potentially increased predation or limited resources to feed those offspring. But as the density of song sparrows increases, the number of offspring goes down. So this is a density-dependent factor. Another example of that would be kelp perch density. So there's a type of fish that lives in a kelp forest, and we see that as the kelp perch density increases, this is 60 per plot, we have the highest rate of predation or mortality of these kelp perch. So this is another example of a density-dependent factor. It's a limit of population growth, and its intensity is directly related to how many individuals there are. Okay, another example of a density, a new example would be an example of a density independent factor. So these are abiotic factors that limit the density of a population. And density-independent factors are often characterized by an exponential-like growth followed by a sudden decline. And so this is an aphid population, and the density is decreasing drastically so these insects feed on the sugary phloem of sap in plants, and they undergo virtually exponential growth in the early spring, and then they rapidly die off when the weather turns hot and dry in the summer. Just a few individuals may survive, and this allows the population to resume growth in favorable conditions. So this would be an example of a density-independent factor that's related to the weather and not to how many aphids there are within the population. Okay, and the last model that we have of a population growth curve is what's called a boom and bust cycle. So here we have an example of the black line is the snowshoe hare and the red line is the lynx. And I'm actually not going to talk about this boom and bust cycle, but I want you to take a look at the graph and notice, when does the snowshoe hare peak? When does the lynx peak? And can you make a prediction for why you think we see these large oscillations in snowshoe hare population and the similar but slightly offset oscillations in the lynx population? And we're going to talk about that in class on the next period, on Wednesday. So come into class with an explanation for the boom and bust cycle of the snowshoe hare and the lynx. Okay, that is all.